Welcome to the next in our series of lectures for Western Civ 1. Today we are going to complete our story of the Black Death and its impact on Western and Southern Europe. As always, there are a number of terms that you should keep track of as you're watching this lecture, as well as a couple of questions that you should be able to answer by the time this lecture is over. So let's get to it. The Black Death did more than just kill millions of people, however. It also had a huge impact upon religion, upon social life, and upon the economy of Western civilization. Think about it. How might the deaths of millions of people have affected those who survived? One of the greatest impacts that the Black Death will be upon religion and the Roman Catholic Church. Many Christians chose to interpret the Black Death, which struck so quickly and without warning, as God's punishment for a sinful world. Some of these Christians argued that the best way to show God how sorry we were for whatever it was we had done was to return to a life of simplicity and to return the church to the simple days of the early church. Other Christians saw things differently, however. They argued that if the Black Death was God's punishment for our sinfulness, then the best thing we could do was to show God how sorry we were for everything that we had done. One group that takes this idea and runs with it is a group known as the Flagellants. The Flagellants are absolutely fascinating. They were groups of men and women who would travel from town to town in groups of 10 to 20. And once they reached a town, what they would often do is they would perform a little ritual. This ritual involved stripping themselves down to the waist. Now again, this was men and women. And it didn't matter what time of year it was. It might be summer, it might be the middle of winter. But in the midst of their ritual, what they would do is they would begin whipping themselves on the back. And oftentimes they would even, to increase the punishment, what they would do is they would tie little bits of metal or glass into the whips so that the whips would really tear into the flesh until the blood would flow and fly. And again, the idea here is if we could punish ourselves, then perhaps we can show God how sorry we are for whatever it is that we've done. And then God will take this disease away from us. Here is an artist's rendering of what the Flagellants looked like. You can imagine that if the Flagellants came to your town, they would stir up quite a bit of excitement. In fact, they drew so much attention to themselves that the church began to pay attention to what the Flagellants were saying. The Flagellants did more because the Flagellants were doing more than simply punishing themselves, doing more than simply whipping themselves. They began to claim to be outside the church. Some claimed that they could perform miracles and even raise the dead. Some began to cast doubt on the necessity of the sacraments. Because obviously, taking communion or having your child baptized was no protection against the Black Death. Indeed, in fact, many of the Flagellants began to cast doubt on the need for a church at all. No surprise, the Roman Catholic Church does not take this challenge lightly. Pope Clement VI will ultimately condemn the Flagellants as heretics. Members will be persecuted, jailed, and in many cases executed for their beliefs. Not everyone, however, saw the Black Death as God's punishment for our sinful world, however. Many believed that someone had brought this disease upon us. In other words, many folks began looking for scapegoats. No surprise, unfortunately, many Christians decided that the guilty persons must be an old adversary. This report comes from the confession of a man named Agamet the Jew, who lived in the city of Geneva in the year 1348. In other words, this was shortly after the Black Death had swept through the city. Now, this is what Agamet claims that he did, and I'll just read it for you. Agamet says he took this package full of poison and carried it with him to Venice. And when he came there, he threw and scattered a portion of it into the well or cistern of fresh water, which was there near the German house, in order to poison the people who used the water of that cistern. And he says that this is the only cistern of sweet water in the city. He also says that Rabbi Parrot promised to give him whatever he wanted for his troubles in this business. Of his own accord, Agamet confessed further that after this had been done, he left at once in order that he should not be captured by the citizens or others, and that he went personally to Calabria and Apulia, and threw the above-mentioned poison into many wells. He confesses also that he put some of this poison into the well of the streets of the city of Balit. Now, earlier on in this document, I think it's probably relevant that the interrogators admit that Agamet only admits this after he's been tortured. So this actually is going to become a common thing across Europe during the Black Death. What I'm saying is that Agamet's confession is evidence that Jews were made scapegoats for the Black Death. And this will lead to horrible outbreaks of anti-Semitism across Europe, especially in areas hit particularly hard by the Black Death. In these areas, Jewish communities will be targeted by mobs. Many will be beaten to death, and others will even be burned at the stake. In one instance, hundreds were locked into a building that was then set on fire. Church leaders, including the Pope, tried to intervene to stop the violence. The Pope pleaded with the mobs. He pointed out that Jews were just as affected by the disease as Christians, but it was to no avail. Anti-Semitic violence will continue to plague Europe for years to come. Thousands of Jews will suffer, and many more will die. But religion and the church were not the only areas affected by the Black Death. Another area to be fundamentally changed by the epidemic will be feudalism and agriculture. Now, to understand why, we need to review how feudalism worked. Remember, what role did peasants and serfs play in the feudal system? They were at the very bottom of society, and in exchange for protection from the invading Vikings and mobs, etc., peasants also were given a plot of land on which they could grow food to support their families. Now, in exchange for this protection and for this land, they owed their landlord labor. They owed him rent as well. So, now, before the Black Death, essentially landlords ruled this system. Landlords called the shots. They were the ones in control. The Black Death, however, is going to kill off so many of the peasants and the serfs that those who are left behind suddenly find that their bargaining position has improved. Let's just look at these numbers from England. Peasants in England would have received about 2 shillings a week in exchange for their labor in the year 1347. In other words, shortly before the Black Death would have struck England. By 1349, a year after the Black Death has passed through England, peasants and serfs are getting 7 shillings a week for their labor. That had risen to 11 shillings per week by 1350. That's more than a 5-time increase in wages. The feudal lords tried to strike back with a law known as the Statute of Laborers. The Statute of Laborers was passed in 1351, and what it tried to do was to force wages down to pre-plague levels. In other words, it tried to artificially deflate the wages of peasants and serfs. This effort fails because the peasants will rebel against this effort. And in the end, many peasants will in fact be freed of their feudal obligations to their lords. In other words, feudalism will be struck a fatal blow in England, and it's all because of the Black Death. A similar scene will break out in France, especially northern France, where once again peasants are trying to increase their wages due to the fact that their labor is now in short supply after the Black Death has killed off so many peasants. Once again, landlords try to deflate wages, and the peasants will rebel. These rebellions are known as the Jacquerie, and they get pretty nasty. Peasants will burn castles and murder nobles. But ultimately, the revolts will fail, and the peasants will be forced back into feudalism. So, where are we? By the middle of the 14th century, civilization is once again under assault, this time from the deadly epidemic of the Black Death. Feudalism is also under assault from peasants. Peasants are now able to demand higher wages because their labor is in short supply. And again, this is directly related to the Black Death, which killed off so many peasants, that now those who have survived can actually demand higher wages. In some areas, this works, like England, where peasants are actually able to successfully negotiate higher wages. In other areas, like northern France, however, feudalism will remain in place. The church will also be fundamentally affected by the Black Death. The church, which seems to have no answer for the disease, is going to be weakened by the Black Death. You saw this in the efforts of the flagellants and those who are beginning to demand a return to a simpler church. All right, so I think we can understand now that the Black Death was an incredibly important event in the history of Western civilization. Not only did it kill millions of people, but it also left Western civilization fundamentally changed.